إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Indeed, all praise is due to Allah, and as such we should praise Him and seek His help and seek refuge in Him from the evil which is within ourselves and the evil which results from our deeds. For whomsoever Allah has guided, none can misguide, and whomsoever Allah has allowed to go astray, none can guide. And I bear witness that there is no God worthy of worship but Allah, and that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam is the last messenger of Allah. We have basically finished the introduction to Islamic law, the foundation principles or pillars of Islamic law, the Quran, the Sunnah, Ijma' and Qiyas. Now we're going to look at what are referred to as the ahkam, or the rulings, the 5 basic rulings which govern all things in Islam. We hear of the terms wajib, fard, sunnah, makruh, haram, etc. These terms we hear applied to different practices, etc. What we'll be looking at now is what these terms actually mean, where they came about, to understand the principles behind them so we can apply them, because they are not terms which are arbitrarily placed on things, meaning the scholars of Islamic law didn't keep a little box of labels, makruh, haram, halal, and whenever they had to rule on something, they would stick their hand in the box and pull out a label and put it down. So no, there are principles, there are governing principles which we have to establish as having been followed to accept rulings that are placed on things. So simply because a scholar says it's makruh, we ask, why is it makruh? It's not makruh because he said it was makruh. It will be makruh because certain principles have been followed which identify it as makruh. So what we're going to do is to look at those principles. Now, the Quran and Sunnah. From it, we have 2 basic categories: the halal and the haram. What is permitted and what is not permitted. What is classified as halal has been further subdivided into 4 subcategories: the wajib, mustahab, mubah, and makruh. Now, what we will look at is the first of those categories, that which is wajib. The other term used for wajib is fard. In most of the schools of Islamic law and amongst most of the scholars, there is no distinction between fard and wajib. Fard means obligatory, wajib means obligatory. The Hanafi school made a distinction. They ruled that what was made obligatory in the Quran we will call fard. What was made obligatory in the Sunnah we will call wajib. But they're both obligatory. This is a semantic distinction, as I said, not recognized by the majority of scholars. Wajib, fard is one and the same. Because it doesn't matter whether it was made obligatory in the Quran or in the Sunnah. It means it's made obligatory by revelation. That's what matters. It is by revelation. And all of these categories basically are determined by revelation. Human reasoning or logic or opinion cannot make halal and haram. It is revelation which makes halal and haram for us. So, we go to our first category, wajib or fard. What this category means in practical terms, when we say something is obligatory, it means that you must do it. If you do not do it, you incur a sin. You have committed a sin. If you do it, you have earned for yourself a reward. That is wajib or fard. Now the question that comes after that is, how do we know when something is wajib or fard? Basically, we know when there is a command, an instruction. Do this. Do that. Now, we know at the same time that sometimes when people say do this, they don't mean it is obligatory. They just mean it's good for you to do it. They recommend you doing it. But they use the phrase do it as a command. So how do we know when a command implies obligation or when it implies recommendation? Which one is the asl or the base? Do we assume that everything in commands means recommendation, and then if evidence comes to show that the intent was obligation, then we say it's obligation? Or do we say that the foundation is that every command means obligation, and if evidence comes to the contrary, we now say it is recommendation? Which way to go? Well, we can go back to language. A command in language. Commands may be given on different levels. We have authorities and we have subjects. When a command is given by a subject to an authority, we call this a plea. Isn't it? When we say to God, help me, does it mean God must help you? Or you're begging him to help you? Right? It's a plea. So a command given by a subject to an authority is a plea. A command given by a subject to another subject is a recommendation. You're not in a position of authority to insist that this person must do it, so therefore all you can do is recommend. But when a command is given by an authority to a subject, that means you must do it. So, when we look at the concept of command, and of course what concepts are we looking at? We're looking at commands from the Quran and the Sunnah. This is authority. When a command comes from the Quran and Sunnah, it means that this particular act which is commanded is obligatory. This is how language functions. If this were not the case, those who want to argue that the command in its origin means recommendation, or that one would have to find out first, that would create chaos in society. If you are the head of your business, you are the principal of the school, you tell the secretary, do this. If the secretary stops for a minute and says, does he mean I have to do this? Or is it only recommendation from him for me to do this? Hey, you've got chaos. You cannot function. Your business will not function. Your school will not function. No. The school, the business, all these things function on the basis that when the boss says do it, you've got to do it. Obligation. Unless he adds tomorrow or day after tomorrow, he adds a circumstance which lets you know that he doesn't intend you must do it right now. So, that is the basic principle. We know that something is wajib or fard when there is a command in the Quran or in the Sunnah for us to do something. That thing is wajib, fard. Unless a further command or circumstance or something comes along to indicate to us that the intent here was not obligation. So we assume that every instruction from the Quran and the Sunnah means wajib. When the Prophet ﷺ said to us, pray as you saw me pray, sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli, he meant you must pray as you saw me pray. He stressed this so much that on one occasion in the masjid, he stepped up on top of the minbar when he was praying sunnah, voluntary prayers. He started his prayer on top of the minbar. Everybody in the masjid was looking at the messenger. What is Rasulullah ﷺ doing? Because they could see he's got to make sujood, and he can't make sujood up there on the minbar. So they watched. He made his qiyam. When he finished, he went into ruku', came out of ruku', and then he stepped back down the minbar till he reached the ground, moved away from the base, and he made sujood. Sat up, made sujood, stood up, walked back up the minbar again. And he completed 2 units of prayer like that. And of course, all eyes in the masjid were glued on him. And when he finished, he turned to them and he said, I only did that so you would learn my way of prayer. Stressing, it is important to pray as the Prophet ﷺ prayed. Also, of course, this particular incident cancels the ruling which is found in the Hanafi madhab, that if a person makes 3 movements, their prayer is invalid. That just blows it out of the water, because the Prophet ﷺ made a bunch of movements. In fact, on another occasion he was praying inside of his home. Aisha came to the door, knocked on the door, and he walked to the door, opened the door, walked back, and continued his prayer. So those arguments about movements invalidating prayer are false, incorrect. But of course, these are necessary movements. And Islam does not encourage movement in general. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ, when observing a man making salah and playing with his beard while he was praying like this, he said, if his heart were at rest, his hands would be at rest. That this is indicative of the state of the heart. And of course, the state of the heart determines to what degree a person earns reward from their prayer. So, instructions from Rasulullah ﷺ or instructions from Allah are obligatory to be followed. And the principle behind these obligations, why did Allah make these things obligatory for us? Is it out of a need that Allah has that we do these things? No. It doesn't affect Allah whether we pray, whether we give zakah, whether we make hajj, we do the things He tells us to do or not. It doesn't affect Him. If we all do it, it doesn't make Him any better. If we all don't do it, it doesn't make Him any less. So He did not instruct us to do these things because He had a need. These things are there because we need it. We discussed earlier when we talked about the purpose of creation, why Allah prescribed worship, and we discussed that in some length. We don't need to go into it in too much detail here. Suffice to say that the reason behind the obligatory areas is that Allah is identifying for us essential acts that we need to do to succeed in this life and the next. Secondly, they train the believer in submission to Allah. They train the believer in submission to Allah. When they do what Allah tells them to do, they develop a sense of submitting their wills to Him, which again is essential for success in this life and the next. It is essential as the foundation of righteousness. Submission is the foundation of true righteousness. Meaning a person may do a good deed, but they have not submitted with their hearts, then that good deed is not truly a righteous deed. It is a good act, but it is not righteousness. It is done for ulterior motives. Thirdly, the areas of obligation, they provide for the believer a framework for life. They provide a structure around which life is organized. There is system here. And we know the importance of system and structure, because businesses, schools, society doesn't succeed, doesn't become a source of benefit unless there is structure, there is organization. So in the same way that we seek these systems and structures in our dunya, in our material life, we should recognize the need in our spiritual life also. The second category, known as sunnah or mustahab. The scholars of Islamic law, they prefer the term mustahab because sunnah can be confusing, but sunnah is still used and it is popular among people to say such and such an act is sunnah, meaning it is recommended. Mustahab in Arabic literally means recommended. Sunnah in Arabic literally means the way, a way. In this context, when we speak about what is recommended, meaning that Allah or His Messenger has recommended that we do these things, it means if we do this act, there is reward. Allah will give us a reward for it. But if we don't do this act, there is no sin. That is the recommended body of acts. Now, this is important to know because you have in some systems, some of the schools of Islamic law, when they teach, for example, Salah, they will teach Salah as being not only the fard but also the sunnah. It means that you have to do all of this. So, for example, as a question was raised to me yesterday, one of the sisters asked, the time for Salah of Fajr was almost running out. There was only enough time to do 2 rakat. Her common sense told her we better do the fard. But everybody was saying, no, we must do the sunnah. Because they were under the impression you cannot separate these two. And I also know amongst my students in the Emirates, some of them who were not praying from similar backgrounds, they were not praying on the basis that, to start to pray involves such a burden on themselves, right? Because in their system, their school that they were following, Isha is like 19 units of prayer. That's how they learn Isha. It's like 19 rakat. So when I was talking about it to them, I said, Islam, it's just 4 rakat of Isha. I said, no. Isha is 19. I said, 19, no. Isha is 4 rakat. That is what is obligatory on you. If you do the others, this is additional reward. But if you only do your 4 for Isha, 3 for Maghrib, 4 for Asr, 4 for Dhuhr, 2 for Fajr, you have fulfilled your obligation. They were shocked. I said, yeah, we can do that. That was something they could see as realistic. They could start to make their prayers on that basis. But otherwise, what they were given was such, a weight that it discouraged them. This is the harm that comes. It discouraged them from even wanting to start. It was just too much. And in fact, those additional prayers are not obligations. You only have enough time for 2 rak'ah before sunrise. Do your fard. The sunnah can be done after sunrise. That is what is the obligation. You see people coming into the masjid who follow that school also. The iqamah has already begun and people are praying fard. They come in for fajr, they go aside and make their sunnah and then join. This is wrong. Prophet ﷺ said, when the iqamah is given, no other prayer is acceptable to Allah besides the obligatory prayer. That is wrong. You join the obligatory and you pray your sunnah afterwards. So, the mustahab, recommended acts, are those which have been recommended by Allah and His Messenger. Now, how do we know when something is recommended? Well, on one hand, it may be something, a religious act, which the Prophet ﷺ did regularly. He always used to do it. Which is not of the compulsory acts, but an additional act, because every compulsory act has similar recommended acts. Right? Every compulsory thing that we have to do in Islam, there is a voluntary version. And whenever we find the Prophet ﷺ doing a voluntary version regularly, then this we know from his practice to be something recommended. Secondly, if Allah or the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that such and such a thing is recommended, he has made the clear statement, that is clear evidence, it is recommended. He may indicate that it is recommended by saying that if you do such and such an act, there is a reward for it, like fasting in Shawwal. He said, whoever fasts Ramadan and follows it up with 6 days from Shawwal, then he gets the reward of fasting the whole year. He gets the reward of fasting the whole year. That great reward for doing that additional act indicates to you it is a recommended act. Thirdly, if he commanded an act, he instructed that you must do this, and then later he stated that you don't actually have to do it, in such a case we know that that command is a recommendation and not an obligation. For example, Prophet ﷺ had said, غسل يوم الجمعة واجب على كل محتلم. Making a ghusl, taking a ghusl on Friday is compulsory on everyone who has reached puberty. So that indicated it is obligatory. And in fact, in the Meccan period, it was obligatory. It was obligatory. And the companions described, they said, when people came together for Jummah, because of the fact that they had just come into Islam, they weren't that familiar with this thing of bathing and all these other kinds of things, because they were coming from a society where water was scarce. When they gathered in the masjid, wearing their clothes that they've been wearing all year long, the smells and the things were just not very nice. So the Prophet ﷺ instructed them that bathing on Friday is compulsory for every one of you that has reached puberty. Later on, after they learned about wudu and how to make wudu regularly and making ghusl after, janaba and ghusl, for after menses and all these other things, people became familiar. It became a part of the lifestyle to be cleaning oneself on a regular basis. Then he said, من اغتسل يوم الجمعة من توضأ يوم الجمعة فبها ونعمت. Whoever makes wudu on Yawm al-Jum'ah, it's a good thing. ومن اغتسل فالغسل أفضل. And whoever makes a ghusl, that is a complete bath, then the ghusl is better. So he has clarified here now that this is a recommendation. So when we find texts from the Quran where there seems to be an obvious command to do something, then we find another text where there seems to be a recommendation for doing something. We need to put these two texts together. We don't just say, I'm going to go with this one. Somebody takes the other one and say, I'm going to go with that one. So you have two different rulings. No. You put these two together. You have to work with the Sunnah as a whole. You have to first determine that the narrations are authentic. Because if one of them is not authentic, then you just drop it all right away and just go with the last one that's there. Finish. But if you confirm that both narrations are authentic, then you must work with both by putting them together and using one to interpret the other, as we have in this case. We also know that something is recommended if Allah or His Messenger prohibits something and then commands that you do it. He prohibits something, then He commands that you do it. That is, a command which follows a prohibition indicates recommendation. That's the principle. This is a linguistic principle applied to law. A command following a prohibition indicates recommendation. So, for example, Prophet ﷺ had said, I used to prohibit you from visiting graves, so now visit them. كنت نهيتكم عن زيارة القبور فزوروها. So go and visit them. It is better to remind you of the next life. Now this command to visit the graves is not an obligation. Everybody must go to the graves. How often? Every day? Every Friday? Every what? No. It was just a recommendation. In Mecca, they were prohibited right across the board from visiting graves. Then permission was given because they were coming out of idolatry, and much of idolatry is connected to the dead. So the initial instruction was stay away altogether. Then later they were permitted. And just as a side point concerning visiting the graves, of course this hadith, when the Prophet ﷺ said this, it applies to both males and females. It applies to both males and females. These kinds of instructions are taken to apply to males and females, though the Arabic says kuntu nahaytukum, I used to prohibit you men, right? That's how it comes in Arabic. You all, you men. But it is known in Arabic that the use of masculine plural, or even the use of masculine singular, where the Prophet ﷺ is speaking, it refers to both males and females unless stated otherwise. That is the general rule. Even in Arabic, when we say, if we greet a woman, we say to her, Salam alaikum, peace be on you all men. That's what you're actually saying. If you wanted to say it to females, literally, linguistically, you should say, Salam alaykunna. That is literal. Salam alaykunna. But we say Salam alaykum. And that includes both males and females. So, that instruction of the Prophet ﷺ addresses both males and females. But there is a qualifying instruction from the Prophet ﷺ in which he said that Allah curses women who regularly visit the graves. And the term he used was Zawaratil Qubur. Zawar is a person who frequently visits Zawar. There's another narration which said Zairat al-Qubur, and it just means those who visit without frequency being indicated. But that narration is not authentic. See, scholars took that narration, which meant any visit, and then prohibited women from visiting altogether. But the authentic narration is those who visit frequently. So women were prohibited from frequent visits because of their emotional makeup. Their finely tuned emotional makeup, where regular visits to the grave becomes something burdensome, affects them to such a degree that, they will end up wailing and screaming and all these kind of things. So, visits on occasion are permissible, but regular visits are prohibited. So when we look now at the purpose behind the recommended areas of worship, we find that we get out of it a benefit that Allah has expanded the area of religious acts for us. Acts where we can earn for ourselves additional reward. Secondly, it trains us in obedience, thereby making obedience to the obligatory commands easier. Right? By us doing those things which are recommended, it makes that thing of submission to Allah easier to do the things which are obligatory. Thirdly, it provides a shield for the obligatory acts. Meaning that if we're doing the obligatory and doing the recommended, the recommended acts as like a shield to protect the obligatory. So that when we are in a state of spiritual weakness, because our iman increases and decreases, when shaitan comes to us in our times of weakness, if we fall at that point and we give up some of our worship, what we give up at that point is our voluntary worship, and our obligatory is still intact. Whereas if a person is only doing the obligatory, when we're on the downside, shaitan comes and hits us and we give up, we're giving up the obligatory and we're falling into major sin. So it becomes a kind of shield to protect the obligatory acts. And fourthly, that area of voluntary acts of worship, they are counted by Allah as additional reward for ourselves, which is used to make up for deficiencies in the obligatory. Meaning when we do obligatory acts, we will not do them perfectly, because we are not perfect. We will have weaknesses in them. So the voluntary acts now make up for the weaknesses in the obligatory. Prophet ﷺ forbade us from repeating an obligatory prayer. This is to protect us. Some people say, why not? If I made my fard prayer and I felt I didn't do a good fard, why can't I do another one? It would appear that we are being denied an opportunity to do it the best way. Why not? Why did the Prophet ﷺ say, no, you did your fajr, that's it, you cannot do it again? To protect us from what? From the whisperings of Satan. From the whisperings of Satan. Because if you didn't have this instruction, you know what would happen? When you do one and it wasn't right, and you say, okay, let me do it again, and it still isn't right, whisperings are coming to you, and you are doing it again and again and again, you will never find yourself doing it. So you will end up just constantly doing this. And you see this happening to people with wudu, for example. You know, waswasa, the whispering, satanic whispering comes on the person when they're making wudu. Oh, did I wash this completely? Did this just block? You see them doing wudu over and over and over and over. Some people do so much wudu they can't even find time to do the fard. It becomes a big fitna for them. So to protect us from these kinds of things, you find that the Prophet ﷺ gave us certain instructions to stop this from Satan messing up our worship. Similarly in prayer, right? Prophet ﷺ said, you know, if you get this sensation, gurgling in your stomach, whatever, and you got the sensation, maybe you passed wind, you know, when you're in ruku especially. What do? He said, well, if you don't smell anything, you didn't hear anything, assume that you haven't broken your wudu and carry on. If you didn't smell anything or hear anything, assume you didn't break it, carry on. Because there is among the evil jinn one belonging to the class he called khinzib, who comes to you when you're in your prayer, when you bend over, and blows on your behind to give you a feeling like you just passed wind, to just mess up your prayer for you. So ignore it and carry on. Now, some people have mistakenly thought that this means, you take this in a general sense. They ask me, say, what if when you're sitting for tashahhud, you're about to finish your prayer, and you pass wind? You pass wind. You know you pass wind, but you didn't smell anything, and you didn't hear it, didn't make a sound. Can you just finish off your prayer? No. If you know you have passed wind, that's it. Even if you're saying salah up, That's it. You have to go and do your prayer all over again. As long as it happens before you complete your taslims, the prayer is invalidated. You have to leave, go back and make wudu, and do it over again. This is the point. Right? So don't misunderstand, this. And there is a weak hadith actually too that states that if you break your wind in that last sitting, that you can finish your prayer, but it's not authentic. Right?
You break the line and just
Yes, you break the line. And I know some people say, what's here in the front line of the prayer? You pass one for you to be walking all the way through everybody. What you going to do? Leave. You can't sit there. Some out of embarrassment, people keep praying. Afterwards, nobody knows, you go back wudu and you come back and pray. No, that's not acceptable either. You have to get out of there right there, because otherwise, what you're doing is sacrilege. You are praying without wudu, and the Prophet ﷺ said, "La salata liman la wudu ala." The salah of one without wudu is unacceptable. So for you to be standing there praying when you don't have wudu, no. Prophet ﷺ said, if you're embarrassed, then put your hand over your nose as if, you had something like your nose bleed or whatever, and you leave the prayer, so people see you, they don't know what actually happened. You can cover yourself that way. He gave you that. But don't stay in the line and continue the prayer. Get out. Even if you're the imam. This is the point. Even if you're the imam, you got to get up and leave. And if the imam gets up and leaves, then somebody from the front line steps forward and completes the prayer. That's what happens.
What if that happens when the imam is in sajda? So
when he's in sajda, he gets up and he leaves. Some imams, they may leave and they may tap the person behind them to let them know, so they got an idea. Or if you just find yourself in sujood and it seems to be long, you are allowed to look up and see what's going on. And if you don't see any imam there, then you get up, you go and you lead the prayer. You get up there and say Allahu Akbar and sit up and finish the prayer. Okay, the third category, which is known as mubah. This is the area where there is no instruction. There is no prohibition, there is no command, no recommendation, no dislike. It's just a neutral area. Areas of foods which you may prefer one over another or the other over the other. This area here is a neutral area where one doesn't put an intention. We're assuming there is no intention there. Because even in this neutral area, if one makes the intention to please Allah in doing this thing, then there is reward. But as a basic area, if we remove the issue of intention out of it, then in doing that act, there is no reward. In not doing it, there is no punishment. It's neutral. Example is given in terms of the practice of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in the case of the desert lizard, the dub, where it was served to him and he chose not to eat it, but his companions ate it. Khalid ibn Walid was there with the Prophet ﷺ. When he saw the Prophet ﷺ not eat it, he asked him, is this thing forbidden? The Prophet ﷺ said, no, I just don't like it. So he took the Prophet's portion ﷺ and ate it. Okay? Now, the purpose behind this category, we can say generally, it is to increase the area of halal acts, just widening the scope, further confirmation that what is prohibited is few. That the basic rule concerning non-religious acts, human interactions and practices, foods, dress, etc. The basic rule is that it is halal. It is from the halal. Either it's mubah, or it's mustahab, or it's wajib. Now, the fourth category is that of makruh, or disliked. And what is meant by it being disliked is that if a person avoids this particular act, they are rewarded for avoiding it. But if they do it, there is no sin on them. This is the opposite of, what is it the opposite of? Of mustahab. It is the opposite of mustahab. Mustahab, if you do it, you're rewarded. Makruh, if you don't do it, you're rewarded. Mustahab, if you don't do it, there is no sin. Makruh, if you do it, there is no sin. It's just exact opposite. Now, how do we know when something is makruh? We know when there has been associated with it something considered nasty or bad or disliked, obviously disliked. Where if you do this, it's like this. As the Prophet ﷺ had said concerning playing backgammon. And this I should mention here, in Sahih Muslim translation, it's mentioned there concerning one who plays chess. This is a mistranslation. This is a mistranslation. The word mentioned in Sahih Muslim in the Arabic is backgammon. Nard. This is backgammon. A game which is popular in the Middle East, where it has, usually it opens up, it's folded up, it opens up a board. It has these diamonds, long diamonds, black on one side, red on the other side. They have a little, look like checker piece that they flip around and they roll a dice and so on and so. Now this game, Prophet ﷺ said, one who plays this game of backgammon is like one who dyes his hand in pig's blood. Now dyeing your hand in pig's blood, this is something despicable. So playing backgammon is something despicable, disliked. Why? Because the game of backgammon is traditionally a gambling game. People who play it, they usually play it for money. So if you play it for money, that's haram, that's gambling, clearly haram. But if you play it not for money, just as a game, then it is considered makruh. So the principle that we can extract out of that and apply it now to the games that we have in our society, the board games and the card games and these kind of things, is that those games which are traditionally gambling games, blackjack, poker, the roulette wheel, these kind of instruments and games and things which people traditionally gamble with, for you to play them for fun is makruh, disliked. Better you didn't. Whereas the other games which are not traditionally gambled with, though some people may gamble, concentration, bridge, many other games, people may play them for money. Pool, poker, not poker, but the other games, whatever the names are. The point is that if people don't traditionally gamble with them, then it's okay to play them. They become mubah, permissible. Once you gamble with them, they're haram. Of course, the games that are recommended Islamically should be Islamic games. These are the ones which you will say mustahab. Games which are designed wherein people are gaining some kind of Islamic knowledge out of it. They've developed certain board games now which are Islamic board games. They have some similarity with the format of some of the regular games, but instead they will have something teaching you something from Quran or from the Sunnah or something like that. We would say that would be a recommended game. Better to do that than to do these. And in terms of games of sport, of course, Prophet ﷺ has already specified for us which are the recommended games. He mentioned swimming, horseback riding, archery. These are among the recommended ones. He used to wrestle also. So wrestling as a sport, judo, these kind of things are also recommended. Also, if Allah or His Messenger has forbidden something and later He did it Himself, He forbade something, don't do this, right? As He said, don't urinate or defecate facing or turning your back towards the Kaaba. He said that, don't do it. Right? Now that instruction by itself could pose a problem. Now when you go back home and you look in your bathroom and you look and see, well, which way is that toilet facing? And sure enough, you're right on the Kaaba, right? What to do now? You have to be climbing sideways and trying. Problems here for us, right? It becomes problematic. So that would have remained a problem, except that one of the companions reported, he was a young companion, I think it was Ibn Abbas, something like this. He had climbed up on the roof of his aunt's house, and he was just looking down, and he saw Prophet Muhammad ﷺ between the houses, using the bathroom, facing the Kaaba. And then he reported it. So from that, it was deduced that the prohibition is in open places, right? Not when you're between walls, where there's something between you, nearby, between you and the Kaaba. So where there's something between you, you're in a house, you're in the toilet, whatever, now it is not a problem. Similarly, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had said, none of you should drink while standing, and if anyone forgets, he should vomit it up. Yep. This hadith is found in Sahih Muslim. You should not drink while standing. And if you catch yourself having forgotten, then you should run to the bathroom and vomit it up. However, Ali ibn Abi Talib, in the masjid of Kufa, after Asr, water was brought to him. He drank some, made wudu, and then he stood up and drank the rest of the water. And he said, some people dislike to drink water while standing, but the Prophet ﷺ did as I did. So it means on occasions the Prophet ﷺ did drink standing. But on the other hand, he said don't. So what do we do here? We have to put these two hadiths together. And what we extract from it is that it is strongly disliked that we do so standing. However, to do so on occasion where it is not convenient or whatever is permissible. We shouldn't make it our habit that we eat and drink standing. In fact, remember we talked about the scholars of hadith and the criterion they had for accepting hadith. One of their criterions was, if they saw somebody eating and drinking standing, they would not narrate hadiths from them. That person was considered to be of bad character. If that was their norm, not on occasion, but if they just saw him, every time they saw him, they're eating and drinking standing, they wouldn't narrate hadiths from them. So, as part of Islamic etiquette, we should train and teach our children to eat and drink sitting. But if the occasion is such that there is no place to sit, or it's difficult, whatever circumstance you're in, you do so on occasion, standing.